In this lesson, we'll take a look at how we can use RSpec hooks within a nested describe or context block. So let's dive right into it. I'll begin with a very basic example. In this high-level describe, I'm going to add two before hooks, one for the context and one for the example. So I'm going to write before context here. Let's give that a do end block. And in here, I'm just going to put puts before context. I'm going to copy this code, paste it below. We're going to make this before example. I'm going to output before example here. And I'm going to do a simple example here. It does basic math. I just need some test right here to run, and I'm going to expect that 1 plus 1 should be equal to 2. This should be pretty familiar by now if I run this spec with RSpec spec nested hooks. We're going to see at the very top we have before context appear first. That is because this thing runs once before everything else within the block. And the block, again, is this big do end block that we pass to the describe method. Afterwards, we move to before example, which only runs runs once before every example in our current describe block. But in this case, we only have one example, so it's only going to run once. So that's going to run, and here we have before example, and finally we have the example with the actual basic math being calculated. So everything looks proper right now. Well, now let's add a little bit more complexity. I'm going to use the context method, which again is just an alias for describe, which allows us to describe a condition, right? A more specific scenario that we're testing. And in this case, I'm just going to arbitrarily say with condition A. We're not actually testing anything real here, so this is for the purposes of example. We can assume we're testing something in a given condition, condition A. I'm going to provide that context method with a block, and what I'm actually going to do is go up here and copy and paste this whole code right here, before context and before example, but I'm going to paste it in here. And in order to distinguish between them, what I'm going to do is scroll up here, and right here before this, I'm just going to write outer before context and outer before example, and below, I'm just going to write inner before context and inner before example. I'm going to do some tests in here, two tests, just to give you a good example here. So let's say it does some more basic math. And here I'm going to expect that, let's again just do 1 plus 1 is going to be equal to 2. And I'm going to copy that example, paste it below, and do something like it does subtraction as well. Totally arbitrary here, but let's just do 5 minus 3, and that should give us 2 as well. All right, so here's my challenge to you. I recommend that you pause the video, and before you execute anything in the terminal, what I recommend you do is guess or try to figure out logically, that's even better of an approach, try to figure out logically what is going to be output with the put statement and in what order and how is it going to occur. And so take a second to think about it, and then what I'm going to do is walk you through what's actually going to happen, and then we're going to execute it in the terminal and see what happens. So let's take 3 seconds to think about it, and then I'll rejoin you after you're done unpausing the video. All right, so we're back. So let's talk about what's going to happen here. The important thing to remember is when we're talking about context, we're talking about the current block. So wherever you're currently placed, whichever do end construct you're inside, that describes your context. So we begin at the most outer level, and then we proceed inwards in RSpec, just like we do in most programming languages. So in here, we start with this higher level block that begins with the describe method, and that's this whole thing that captures all of our examples and all of our nested contexts. So that context, that whole thing, is the beginning of the top level context. So this line 2 to 4, the outer level context is what's going to run once. It's going to run once a total time, because it is the first thing within the current context, which is the most higher level one we're dealing with. All right? At that point, RSpec sees that we have an example right here, and it also sees that we have a before example. So what's going to happen is RSpec says, okay, this needs to run before every example in the current scope. So what it's going to do is run this one. So we're going to see outer before example, and then RSpec is going to run this test for us. This is all pretty simple. This is what we just showed a couple minutes ago when we ran this before the nested context. The real question is, what's going to happen when we dive into here? So here's where it gets really interesting. We're now entering a brand new context. Now the context method gives it away here, but remember this could also be described. So you really shouldn't use the basis of the method that's being called. What you should really use is the basis of the block here. So we have a brand new block. It starts right here on line 14, do, and it ends right here on line 30 with end. So this is our second context. It's our nested context. So what's going to happen is this top level one has already ran in its context, but this new context that's defined in line 15, only for condition A, has not yet run. And since we're entering now the testing part of that context with condition A, lines 15 through 17 needs to run once total before all of the tests in here run, right? So it's not going to run multiple times, but it's only going to run once inner before context, because this is the first time we're evaluating any code within our condition A context. So this is going to run lines 15 to 17. Afterwards, again, RSpec is going to see a before example, and it's going to see two examples, and you might think that it's going to dive right into this. But as it actually turns out, what's going to happen is it's actually going to execute this thing first. And the reason is because all outer level befores are also going to be valid in inner level context. It's not the other way around. So let me reiterate what that means. In this nested scope, this thing is obviously not going to run before this example up here on line 10. However, in reverse, when we have a higher level scope, this example is defined outside of this nested scope that begins with context. This example before hook is going to run before every example in here. What's also going to run is this before hook with every example in here, because it's also defined, but only within this context. So what's going to happen is this thing is going to run for everything that's nested below it. Then this thing is going to run. Then we're going to do our first example. Then RSpec is going to climb back up into the higher scope and do before example again. There's no need to do before context, because remember, that's for this higher level block and that's already been taken care of. There's no reason to do this before context because that's already been taken care of within that context. But we still need that higher level before example. And then we're going to do our internal nested inner example. And then we're finally going to finish up with our final example. And it's a lot to take in, but obviously this logic will apply the exact same when you're dealing with after hooks. So if you do something after example, the exact same global, local context rules will apply. If it's defined at a higher level, it's going to run after every example at a lower nested level. But if it's an after hook that's defined in a lower nested level, then it's not going to run at a higher level for those examples, if that makes sense. So one more time, let's just go through this just really, really quickly. We're going to begin with before context, then before example for our outer level example. Then we're going to do the example, all right? Then we're going to dive into our context. We're going to run this before context once, right? It's the first time we're in this context. We're then going to do before example up here, before example right here, and then we're going to do this example, the very first one in our nested context right here on lines 23, 25. We then are going to do one more time before example right here, before example in the inner scope, and then the second example, and then we're done. Let's take a look at what that's going to look like in the terminal. Let me scroll up here. So one more time, we can go through it and exactly what's happening. Let me scroll up the code and we'll match it with the terminal output. Outer before context, we're entering our describe methods context right here, this do block, which means this is the code that interjects in that process, steps in and says, okay, it's now my job to execute something before everything starts running within this block. That's going to be our outer before context. That's what we see right here. We then have one example in the outer scope, and the only single hook that applies from that point forward to that is the before example. So we're going to have outer before example. This is what we see right here. Then RSpec is going to actually do the example right here on lines 10 to 12. Then we move into our nested context. The first thing that needs to happen is RSpec has a new before hook that's defined only within that context. It only needs to run once within this block that begins on line 14. So we're going to have our inner before context execute. That's coming from line 16. And then, just as I talked about earlier, we're going to have two before hooks for each example run. One is going to be the outer one, which is defined in the outer scope, and one is going to be the inner one. So first we're going to do lines 6 through 8, then lines 19 through 21, and then the first example. And then that exact same logic is going to apply outer before example, inner before example, and then the final test that we have written here, the final example on lines 27 through 29. This is really tough. All right, it's a tough thing to wrap your mind around it, and we've only done it, by the way, 2 levels, or 2 total levels, maybe 1 level deep is another way of putting it. In real professional code bases, what you're going to find is that people are going to go even more levels deep, 3 levels down, 4 levels down. Why would they want to do that? Well, the whole point is to essentially refactor and dry up the tests as much as possible. Maybe you're going to have a certain context or a certain condition that you're testing where you want something to run once before all tests, or you want something to run once before every single example, but you don't want it to do the same thing in another context because that's going to be a waste of resources and a waste of computational power. If you successfully organize your tests and your before and after hooks, the goal is that each test will only rely on a hook that provides it something that it needs to optimally run and removes all the duplicate code that you would have to run within the actual example itself. Your goal, your kind of sign of ultimate progress in RSpec is if your examples are super simple like this. If you just have an it statement and an expectation and there's minimal setup within the example, which means the before is taking care of it as much as possible. It's not always going to be the case, but as much as your examples are super clean and just have an expectation or two, that's a good sign that your spec file is in a good shape, in a Ruby-like shape that's very clean and elegant and dried up. All right, that's a lot to cover in this lesson, so if you feel a little bit confused, feel free to rewatch it. I'm also going to provide you several assignments moving forward that will allow you to really reinforce these concepts and practice with them. We might even go an additional level deep just to make sure you have a strong understanding of before and after hooks in a nested context. But at the base level, it just allows us to write more dried up specs, and RSpec is simply going to jump around and figure out what it needs to run before every example. Again, before context means run once within the current context or within the current block is the right way of thinking about it. And before example means run once before every example, but only within that current block. So in this case, this before example applies to both this example as well as the one or the two below it, because they're still within the same outer level context that this high level before is defined in. In comparison, before example on lines 19 to 21 is only defined within this context with condition A, so it only needs to run before these two examples, not the ones above. It's a lot to take in, but this is our very first introduction, so feel free to rewatch the lesson, and I'll give you plenty of practice moving forward with these concepts as well. So I'll see you in the next one.